pleasure to have you all here to be talking about transportation and rail. Some of you may not know that when the Whaling Museum's story is being told about the whaling industry, that there was actually train service to Boston at the height of the whaling industry. Of course, that was only about 150 years ago. So it's only taken us that long to come back and start talking about rail service to Boston. But it's a pleasure to have you here. I encourage you to come back and visit the Whaling Museum. It is, in fact, a national treasure that we have here in terms of the history of the whaling era. And I certainly think that it's an important piece of our legacy here in New Bedford. With that, I will then welcome the mayor of the city of New Bedford, John Mitchell, who has been mayor for 7 years, who has been really transformative in so many ways. The city has embarked on so many initiatives over the course of his tenure, and it's just really remarkable to think that we have the best bond rating the city has ever had. We have real reform happening in our public school system. We have more solar panels per capita than any other city except for Honolulu, Hawaii. So many things that are just truly important, and as he is leading us in the era where we certainly want to get connected to Boston, at the same time we want to develop the important things that are happening in New Bedford so that folks from outside of New Bedford can get here as much as we want to be able to get to Boston. And so with that, I would ask John Mitchell to come up and welcome us.
Tony, thanks for aggressively insinuating yourself into the program so I could receive that warm introduction. I appreciate that. And thank you, Tracy, for kicking things off. And I want to thank our friends, our really good friends from Mass Inc. for all the work they do, and Ben Foreman and his team, of course, for helping us grapple as a Commonwealth, as cities individually, with some of the trickier and more complex challenges of our day. I just want to kick things off and obviously get out of the way and begin the discussion on today's agenda, which is a really important one, with just a few words of perspective. I mean, the work that has been done in understanding the implications of the modern knowledge economy in Massachusetts and New England more generally, I think is really key to not only Greater Boston, the future of Greater Boston, but also for all the cities that are outside of the Boston orbit, like New Bedford. And as I look around the room today, it's, as I'm seeing folks from certain other cities. I think I saw Bill Carpenter hiding back there. There he is, a good friend, the mayor of Brockton, and Kathy Viveris, the chief administrative officer in Fall River, and cities around the state like ours and places like Springfield and Worcester, have give a lot of thought to our place in the world and our relationship to other cities. And as folks in New Bedford have heard me say before, in establishing a future for ourselves and pursuing a future, we have to understand where we are in the world. We live at a time where the technology is rapidly changing our American economy and our culture, for that matter, and we're starting to see many of the implications of the introduction and the proliferation of things as close to our hearts, quite literally, as our smartphones and other new technologies to come that will be as disruptive or even more so, and what that means for economic competitiveness, as well as local identity and connection to place. And so these discussions are very key. One of the big trends that I think every city of our size, New Bedford's a city of 100,000, we have a metro area, or suburban ring of about 200,000, and cities of similar size have to wrestle with is, how do you compete in this global economy where the winners tend to be more and more so these days the superstar cities. Boston, of course, is one of those cities, but there are many of them around the country, and we know their names. They so happen to correlate with the cities that happen to have a professional sports team. The cities of that size tend to be, the gravitational centers. But a lot of America lives elsewhere, right? And so, we live in a time where there is a fair disconnect between the two, and that disconnect, I think, in some ways explains a lot of what's happening to America today, including the results of, the presidential election a couple of years ago. So these big questions that we ask ourselves are really about our future, the future of our children and grandchildren. And some places will be left behind, others will keep up. But we need to understand the steps that we have to take to make sure that our particular places are well suited for the future. And on the other side of the coin, in the case of those superstar cities, to make sure, like Boston, our political capital and the commercial capital of New England, how they can remain competitive in a global economy. And so this discussion, on the one hand, focuses really, frankly, on Boston's ability to remain competitive and have access to a competitive workforce in the years ahead. And it is centered around, on the other hand, the ability of cities in varying degree to connect to Boston, but also to maintain their own individual identities and create alternate settings for the good life, right? Not everybody's going to want to live in the major metros by choice. In New Bedford, the way that we frame it is, and if I were in Bill's shoes, I'd probably have something different to say as far as connections to Boston, but the way that we go about it is in some ways a function of distance. A city that is 20 miles from Boston or pick any other major metro in America might see the need to connect in different terms in a city like in our case, which is 60 miles away, or in the case of, say, Springfield from Boston, which is roughly 85 to 90 miles away. And the balance between connectedness, maintaining that connectedness or establishing connectedness, and all that follows from that, development, transit-oriented development, and so forth, it has to be balanced with how much we do, as Tony was alluding to in his opening remarks, how much we do to create a gravitational center here in place. And for New Bedford, we have to do a little bit of both. We've been for years pursuing the South Coast Rail project because we do see it as an important public asset that can lead to economic development. Having connection to Boston will be one more thing for people to set up shop here, to live here, and so forth. At times, and I think a lot of you have heard me say this, at times I think it's the benefits of that program, that project, have been somewhat overstated, at least for New Bedford. And I'm not speaking for other cities now, but the prospect of sitting on a train for a long time is not one that everybody is going to embrace. Some people will, some people won't. But on balance, having that connection is a good thing. Where at the same time, we have to build on our inherent assets. You have a bird's eye view of the New Bedford waterfront. This is the largest commercial fishing port in the United States. It is the largest seafood processing center in the United States. It is about to become the launching pad for the offshore wind industry in the United States. There are inherent economic advantages here of having this fully faceted port and port workforce that allows us to compete in a global economy, and we're doing everything that we can to build on it. So for us, it's doing a little bit of both. It's having the connection to a major metro, and by the way, it's having connections to other metros through what we're doing at our airport right now, which I think holds a lot of promise in the long run, and building up what we do here, not only what we do here, but what we do, frankly, better than anybody in the country, if not the world, because therein lies a tremendous economic advantage, and, by the way, a sense of place. At the end of the day, people, and it's, nobody can predict the future all that well, and I'll just sort of close with this. There are places, and I mentioned this in my State of the City address for those of you who were there last week. 12 years ago, nobody thought that these rectangular cell phones were going to revolutionize the way we live, could enable us to manage much of our lives, and be the launching pad for who knows how many new industries, just in a matter of a few years, right? So as we look ahead at the prospect of things like autonomous vehicles of every sort, there will be a level of disruption that we're not going to that we don't fully understand now. You look at things as real as autonomous hovercraft taxis that are being rolled out in places like Singapore and Dubai. You wonder further still how well we can predict the future. But what we do know is that in the long run, good infrastructure matters, developing people matters, developing through every K through 8 system workforce, every chance we have to develop people as assets is important. And we also know that when we identify our competitive economic advantages in our place, that is really important in the long run as well. So those are the efforts that we undertake here in New Bedford, and every city will do it slightly differently based on where they are in the world and what their set of assets are. But as we enter this discussion today and continue in the years ahead, we'll have to keep that in mind as we plan and as we do our best to predict the future. So I look forward to the discussion. And again, I thank Mass Inc. in particular for all the work that you guys are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Mitchell, and also let me extend my thanks to the New Bedford Economic Development Council, as well as to the South Coast Development Partnership, and to the City of New Bedford for co-sponsoring this event. You guys have done a tremendous job in helping us kick off this series of conversations around what it's going to take to be more prepared for that future that you were just talking about, Mayor Mitchell. And so one of the reasons why we kicked off this transformative transit-oriented development initiative is to start thinking more about where we want to go in the future. It's been kind of interesting to see that here in the United States that a lot of the conversations around transportation, transit, and development have been really focused on kind of where we are today, and places are unprepared. I can tell you that coming from Seattle, where spent 16 years there doing a variety of things around development, no one could foresee the number of people who descended on Seattle. I think in the 6 years since I moved to Massachusetts, they've added 100,000 new jobs, but they have 100,000 people who are homeless. And so these are the kinds of things we want to make sure that Massachusetts is prepared for moving into the future. And that's part of the reason why we're doing the Transformative Transit-Oriented Development Initiative. So I'm going to try to keep my background or information about our research short so that we can get to the panel discussion. But this is an overview of the Transformative Transit-Oriented Development Initiative at Mass Inc. And I'm pushing the wrong button. So back in April 2018, Ben and his team actually put together a report called The Promise and Potential of Transformative TOD in Gateway Cities. They found in the report that given the current utilization of land and resources in the gateway cities, that there was a huge gap between what was existing and what could be there. I know that they are projecting that here in Massachusetts by 2025 that they're expecting an additional 250,000 inhabitants to hit the state. Where are those people going to go? One of the things to keep in mind is that they're focused on the Boston metro region, but we have a huge opportunity to actually disperse some of that population as well as some of those jobs across the state. As you can see, between the current and potential utilization, there's about 140,000 both people and jobs that could be in the gateway cities. When we talk about transformative, when talking about transit-oriented development, instead of just building dense development and walkable places near transit stations, we talk about what we call the virtuous cycle of TTOD benefits that include environmental, fiscal, and equitable growth benefits. Around the environmental, key things to keep in mind is it's not just making things greener. A lot of people have different conceptualizations of what it means to be climate and environmentally responsible. But it's about developing energy efficient buildings and infrastructure, particularly around our transit stations, making sure that we're integrating resiliency for climate change so that as things do change, as water tables drop and sea levels rise, that we're actually creating infrastructure that can respond to that. Maximizing infrastructure through compact land use, because we know that the more efficiently you use the land, the less drag it has on environmental resources, both locally as well as globally. Encouraging clean, sustainable transit modes, travel modes. Well, I say transit, that was a Freudian slip, because you do want to encourage public transit wherever possible, whenever you can move the most number of people with the fewest vehicles on the roads. And then minimizing negative health impacts. We know that negative climate impacts do things like asthma is a huge, huge issue in a lot of communities just because of emissions from vehicles running through their communities. When we talk about the fiscal, we're of course making sure that our gateway cities are financially healthy and sustainable. Making sure that we're generating sustainable revenue flows and investments in the gateway cities. Making sure that we're creating more productive, self-sufficient, and resilient local and regional economies, not just for Boston, but across the state. And also stimulating investment, reinvestment, and increasing efficiency in the use of fiscal resources. On the equitable growth, I know that there are a lot of, this is probably the area where conceptualizations of what does equitable growth look like diverge the most. But whenever we at Mass Inc. think about equitable growth, we're thinking about bringing jobs and opportunities closer to where residents live. It's not just about getting people into Boston, it's about making sure that we actually get more jobs here in southern Massachusetts as well. We're making sure that we're attracting new residents and businesses while keeping the existing ones in place. Displacement is a huge, huge issue within Boston as well as in communities across Massachusetts. I remember hearing a story about someone who actually was pushed out of Roxbury in Boston because of the high rents into Fall River, and are now getting pushed out of Fall River because they can't afford the rent. And so either we need to, well, not either, we need to both increase incomes as well as make sure that the housing that's being created is actually affordable for the people who live there. Generating more geographically balanced growth, once again dispersing it across the state. Creating wealth and, through reinvestment, making sure that we're reinvesting in our communities and not just following our resources into one region or another, or even having them move overseas. Assuring access to public goods, and also making places where residents and visitors feel like that they belong. So with our TTOD strategy, we're looking at balancing both transit as well as development policy, both at the state level as well as at the local level. What do we need to put in place to make sure that we are creating transformative transit-oriented development and not just development for development's sake? And we're doing that through 3 methods, one of which is convening, which is what we're doing here today. The other path that we're taking is through investigations, where we're doing a series of research reports as well as policy briefs and other types of things where we're taking a deeper look at the issues that are affecting our gateway cities today. And then also communications. So we're doing a number of things to communicate through our Gateway Cities journal, through our Gateways podcast, and also through some of the op-eds like the op-ed you have on your seat today. So when it comes for the potential of development, Boston as a metro region casts what economists tend to call an agglomeration shadow over the surrounding communities. However, in the Governor Baker's Future of Transportation Commission report, he calls for a very succinct need for us to think about dispersing that growth, not just shoehorning it into the Boston region, but also thinking of our gateway cities as hubs of growth and development across the state. We want to make sure that we are making sure that the gateway cities like New Bedford are actually creating vibrant economies for the surrounding communities near New Bedford, that Fall River is doing the same, that Taunton is doing the same, that Attleboro is doing the same, that Brockton is doing the same. It's not just about being in Boston's shadow. Right now is a very interesting time for thinking about where the opportunities are when it comes to development. When we think about state level policies, we have a timeline here that kind of shows what's been happening since 2010 around development, but what's most interesting is to kind of look at what's been happening just since December of 2018. In that, or actually since January of this year, I know that Mass Inc., this is a report that Ben did. By the way, I came on board back in December to Mass Inc., and so I'm relatively new to the organization, but very passionate about these issues, and so this is something that I've been trying to make sure that I'm keeping on top of. Back in January, Mass Inc. issued its Neighborhood Stabilization Report, which proposed measures for addressing not just large-scale developments in our gateway cities, but also in addressing issues like spot blight, of where you're having a lot of buildings that are in disrepair. I know that some communities like Worcester have a large percentage of triple deckers in their communities that need revitalization. So some of the development opportunities aren't just about making 200 unit condo or apartment buildings. There are other needs that have to happen in order to make vibrant neighborhoods more vibrant. And so MassInc did an investigation to that and issued a report. And in January, Representative Cabral and Senators Lesser and Crichton actually announced the Neighborhood Stabilization Bill that actually followed that. We have a couple of other legislative measures right now. Everyone is really hot for figuring out how to address the housing crisis that we have currently. We know that in some of our gateway cities, when it comes to extremely low income, households, they're usually paying 79% or more of their income just for housing utilities. And there are a large number of people across the state, I think the statistic is around 30%, are actually paying more than 50% of their income on housing utilities. This is something that needs to be addressed. And so Governor Baker did reissue the Housing Choice Bill to talk about ways in which local municipalities can more easily adopt zoning changes, as well as has called for 135,000 new housing units and put into place some additional measures to increase density and increase housing. So we also have a potential around transit service, which actually Gene Fox is here today from MassDOT to talk about in a little bit more detail. But in addition to the South Coast Rail, which I'm pretty sure a majority of you here in the southern part of the state have heard about, there's also the Rail Vision exercise that is going on at MassDOT, where they're actually looking at different options for increasing rail service that includes the South Coast Rail full build, as well as just phase 1 build. And so I encourage you to go online. We don't have any information here for you today, but there are the 7 different scenarios for different levels of service, what it would mean both technically, but the ultimate goal is to actually get to having 15-minute service, trains every 15 minutes to key stations throughout the system all day long, and of which the station in New Bedford, Fall River, and Attleboro, as well as Brockton, would be those stations that will get 15-minute all-day service. And here's just a little closer look at, you can see here the green dots are where the key stations are located. Also, there's an opportunity when it comes to transit policy, and this is actually more, the momentum here has been much more recent than with development policy, in that in the past, it's actually been in the past 2 years that the conversation's been changing more towards looking at what the state can be doing more aggressively with transportation. But actually since December, since the release of Governor Baker's commission, Future of Transportation Commission, since the release of their report, there has been a lot of momentum around coming together to improve transit and transportation throughout the state, with public transit being the #1 priority in that report. Unfortunately, gateway cities are number 14 in the report, but they are a priority to make sure that our gateway cities become regional hubs of economic activity. And so in December 2018, the commission released this report. Rail Vision actually, its task force actually released these 7 options to the public for the first time on March 5th. On March 12th, this was all happening very rapidly in March, Speaker DeLeo and President Spilka in the Senate appealed for ideas from the business community for how to generate new revenues. And there are a couple of different task forces that have formed around that to kind of generate some ideas as to how to more aggressively find the funding that's needed, to the tune of, I think we have a $19 billion gap as far as an existing backlog in MassDOT. I'm not quite exactly sure what it is. It's more like 9 billion? Okay. Billion. Yes, 9 billion. And then we're not exactly sure exactly what it's going to take, but thinking towards the future, if you think about Seattle has issued a ballot initiative, which is something that is also as an opportunity for us to think about regional ballot initiatives. The Seattle region has actually authorized, I think it's $54 billion to invest in their train system. And Los Angeles has voted for, these are all ballot initiatives where people actually voted for these things, voted for $128 billion. And so those are the kinds of numbers we need to be thinking about moving forward into the future for how to improve the transportation system here in Massachusetts. And so I think that's it. So I'm going to leave this here, and now I'm going to ask Jean Fox to come up and actually have a conversation about South Coast Rail, and then we will return to our panel. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
I hope that's, down is up, right? But it's not. Oh, there it is. I knew that down was up. So, thank you, everybody, for having me here. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces, and a lot of you already know an awful lot about South Coast Rail, but I think, to Dr. Corley's point, seeing where it fits into the rail vision will be a little bit of a new angle for folks. I do want to update you on where we are, because we're in a very different place right now. So I'm going to talk first about the Phase 1 implementation plan and what we're doing. No, the grade crossing wasn't supposed to be there, but what we're doing now, and then I will morph into a little bit more on the rail vision. So why are we doing it? We want to bring commuter rail service to the region quicker. We want a one-seat ride from New Bedford and Fall River. The cost of the full-build Stoughton electric straight alternative had just gone out of the park at $3.2 billion, and that's in 2016 dollars. And the design and construction timeline was lengthened substantially. There are so many more environmental impacts with the electric service via Taunton. We would have had numerous variances, and then there were the complex structures such as the trestle through the Hockomock Swamp. So our environmental permitting, we have almost everything right now, and we didn't need a single variance. I'm still doing down, no I'm not, there we are. So what are we doing? Instead of Stoughton, Phase 1 extends the existing Middleborough service down to the cities of Taunton, Fall River, and New Bedford. We're reconstructing 56% of the track miles we need for the Stoughton. We have 2 new layovers, one in Fall River and one in New Bedford, and we're doing 6 stations, so not all of the stations will be built in Phase 1. Benefits, obviously, we get service a lot sooner. We recognize the need for improved air quality and our economic and smart growth benefits. We will see those a lot sooner. We, again, don't have any variances, so our wetland impacts are minor, relatively speaking, and it is a very solid foundation for full build. Here are our permits. I'm not going to read them all. One outstanding order of conditions, that's here in New Bedford for the Church Street Station, and I got word this morning that my core permit is about to issue. So we're really, really close. You cannot put out your construction packages unless you have all your permits in hand. This is the service right now as proposed. There are 24 trips a day on the Middleborough-Lakeville line. We're adding 2 train sets. So it's not the most robust service in the world, but it is certainly a very good start. We're serving the peak periods fairly robustly. If people can drive up to Taunton and Middleborough, they'll get a lot more trains. So instead of the 3 going to Fall River and New Bedford, you could catch the 6. We are right now, we put out a special track work, that's turnouts. That's a long lead item that we felt we should get out on the street very quickly. That's been awarded to Progress Rail. 63 culverts, most of those are going to be replaced, but a number of them, I think 16, will be cleaned out. And the granite that we retrieve from these culverts is going to be repurposed. We have an agreement with Fisheries to bring that granite here to New Bedford, and that granite will become artificial reefs off the Cape. Also, 4 bridges, the last 4 bridges that need anything on the New Bedford main line are, tomorrow's the bid opening date. So we're going to see the Cotley's, Fallbrook, and Cedar Swamp. Then we're going to have a major contract, hopefully later in the fall, for the New Bedford main line and the Middleborough secondary. So if you look on the map over there, it's that line going up on the right and banging a right over to Middleborough. That's going to be one contract. It doesn't need any more bridges, as I said. It's tracks and stations. So Fall River will be a second contract, major one. There's a lot more bridge work that needs to be done on the Fall River secondary. It doesn't look like it's a big contract, but it really is because of the complexities involved in that. And then the signals and comm package will go out either as part of these 2 bigger ones or separately, and that includes PTC. Just, not that I'm from Freetown or anything, but I'm from Freetown. And most of our stations look like this. They're a side platform with parking, signage, bicycle accommodations, things like that. So they mostly look like that. And here's a rendering. So, you know, they look like pretty much any MBTA commuter rail station. Taunton has a middle platform, one in the middle, center aisle platform, and it's going to be a lot bigger because everything kind of comes together in Taunton. So what are we going to do? We're going to finish the permitting, which it sounds like I'm about done with. The early action bridge project is going to go. We have final design. We're at roughly 90 to 100% on all the pieces. We have to continue with our preliminary engineering for the full build. We have to, anything that comes out of the permitting process that has to be put into the construction packages has to be married into those. And we're going to continue our coordination with the communities. I spent 2 nights last week in Berkeley. I've got a couple of other meetings coming up. We want to work with each of the communities as this thing moves, and it's moving at lightning speed for something of this scope and magnitude. So, Rail Vision, big, overarching, statewide proposition that says, what do we have in our existing network that's going to meet the transportation and economic growth needs of our region? It's supposed to match service with growing and changing needs, so we have to be sort of thinking forward here. It's definitely designed to increase economic vitality, to provide equitable and balanced investments, and to help us achieve our goal as a Commonwealth for climate change resiliency targets, and obviously return on investment. These were the guiding questions. How do we reduce highway congestion so you don't have to do 24 anymore? And diminish the vehicle miles traveled, auto emissions. How do we get service to the inner core that operates more like rapid transit? And how can we enable access to Boston's employment pool for job clusters beyond the inner core? Reverse commutes are one way of doing it, and certainly was part of the guiding questions. And then support economic development, this is primary and in the forefront, economic development in the gateway cities and other urban areas outside the inner core by focusing on schedules. You alluded to the 15-minute headways. That's in the mix. And on the needs of these communities. Here's where we are. So we've done the qualitative evaluation. We've developed the ideas. We've sketched models. In 7 of the alternatives, phase 1 for South Coast Rail figures into 3, and full build figures into 4. We're now looking at the alternatives evaluation. We're going to be working with CTPS on ridership and an operations analysis. And then the end, hopefully, will be a rail vision. Oh, there it is. There we are, 3 alternatives in the 4, the full build. In all service levels, in any case, is at a minimum of what we've defined in South Coast Rail. So now, we're working with C2PS with a travel demand model. We are modeling operations, and we're looking at what the infrastructure and capital costs will be. We're identifying potential land use and demographic effects of one or more of the different alternatives using the regional dynamic model, and we're developing the capital and operating costs. Then the results will be very publicly shared. All of these topics are going to be in the alternatives analysis, and details on each one can be found if you go to the website on this. There we are. Rail Vision's mbta.com/railvision. That's it.
Great. I'm glad we got through that. I know Jean was rushing a little bit. I tried to rush. I always try to rush. Yeah. But we want to make sure we leave as much space as possible for our panel. Because whenever we talk about transit-oriented development, it is an integration of transit and development, about how do we do these things together, how do we do them smart. I don't know why things are, oh, sorry, I know why things are I was like, I didn't touch anything. So we want to now bring up our panel, which includes Rob May from the City of Brockton, Kirsten Bryan from the City of New Bedford, Ted Carman from Concord Planning and Development, and Angela, should I call you Angie? Constantino from Serped. And then also, this panel is going to be moderated by Tony Sapienza from the New Bedford Economic Development Council. So, great, thanks.
So, welcome again, and I'll now put on my New Bedford Economic Development Council hat, because I chair the Economic Development Council here in the City of New Bedford. And obviously, we as an economic development agency are particularly interested in TTOD. It has all kinds of potential for the city, And as we have seen job growth here over the last 10 years, significant job growth. The mayor didn't allude to it, but in 2016, the city of New Bedford had the highest, the fastest decrease in its unemployment rate of any major metropolitan area, and it all had to do with, obviously, getting more jobs. And clearly, jobs are very, very much a part of our agenda here locally. In addition, you know, housing is another important agenda for our Economic Development Council. We've had historically, you know, a relatively low housing costs in New Bedford, which is a good thing. The bad thing about that is when you try to build a project and the construction costs are roughly 90% of what the construction costs are in Boston or in the 128 belt, and the rents are roughly 55% of what's in that belt, it makes it very, very difficult to have you know, new market rate housing development, and that's a real problem for the city. We've had great mill conversion projects, but quite frankly, we're running out of mill space that we can convert into housing. So we are very interested as an Economic Development Council to promote both housing and job creation, and certainly think that transportation, and again, the reverse commute and the two-way nature of what South Coast Rail potentially brings to New Bedford is very, very important. So we'd like to learn a little bit about, from our friends in Brockton, who are a little closer to Boston and have had rail service, and can tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll go through the panel, and I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves so you have a better sense as to who they are. We'll start with Rob.
We got enough cord? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Rob May. I'm Director of Planning and Economic Development for the City of Brockton. And do you want to do introductions all the way across first, or?
One at a time.
One at a time. Okay. Presentation?
Sure.
All right. Here we go. I feel naked without a table here. It's just kind of disconcerting. I want to take you back a couple of years, and that's the time between 1990 and 2010, maybe. I picture Brockton in that time as kind of like being inside of a snow globe. And while Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Waltham all start exploding in that period of time, you see growth that's going on in New Bedford and Lowell and Worcester are going on. Brockton is trapped in this bubble. And during that 30-year period or so, people have been vigorously shaking that bubble, the snow globe. And so you've had all these, you know, socioeconomic and demographic changes, you know, swirling around the city. But the basic layout of the city, we hadn't grown, we hadn't changed much. We're, you know, trapped. So along comes this guy named Bill Carpenter, new mayor, you know, at that time, current mayor, yay. And, you know, he runs for mayor. His slogan is, "It takes a carpenter to build a city." Kind of clever. Is he still here? Shoot. Okay, I got to clean it up then. But one of the first things he does when he gets elected is he calls Marty Jones at Mass Development. And, you know, obviously she's got money. So, Marty, what can we do? And Marty says, you know, you got a great place here, but you don't have a planner, you don't have a plan. You know, until you get your house in order, is that clean enough? You're really not going to go anywhere. And so, you know, 6 months, 8 months later, I get hired. And, you know, I'm not Helen, no, it's not Helen Keller, it's Miracle Worker, it's around. Anyway, it's Annie. But we start putting together a plan, and we become designated as a TDI district. And we worked very closely with a young woman named Claire O'Neill, who really helped us put together the downtown action strategy. And so for years, people have been running out and saying, hey, let's do a plan. And the plan just sits there. And so we said, okay, there's some good plans and some good ideas here, but we need to put this into an actionable format. And so we also decided that if we're going to do this, we need to have an urban renewal plan that goes along with it, and we need to have a DIF district. So the downtown action strategy gave us a vision of what the community wants to see in downtown. It gave us the authority through the urban renewal to execute that plan, and the DIF gives us some funding to help grease the skids a little bit, making infrastructure improvements. And throughout all of that process, we've been adding other elements to this initiative. And so where we are right now, we've been designated as a federal opportunity zone. And we thought it's important that we start being proactive. We take our message out on the road. And so we've come up with this downtown, this Brockton investor strategy, or investment prospectus, excuse me. Down is advance. No, it's not. Oh, magic. Somebody else is back there. So overview of what's happening. Brockton is 30 minutes from downtown by train, and we're blessed to have rail in our downtown. And I know several other communities would give their eye teeth for that. But you got to remember that in the 30 years, we've done nothing with that. We also have a great workforce. I've got it upside down. That's the way, okay. Up is down and down is up. Okay, thank you. We've got a well-educated workforce, a lot of people with college education, not necessarily in town, but around town, and it really builds that reinforcement that we're a regional hub for Southeast Mass, except for the seacoast. And then, if you look at some of the investment opportunities, there's some really great work going on. So here we are, 30 minutes from downtown. Another 15 minutes, you can be in Kendall Square. This is the secret sauce. This is the 7-layer dip. Oh, Ted, can I ask you, could you grab my blue backpack? Sorry. So somebody came up with this concept of the 7-layer dip. Could you hold that for a second? And I don't know where the name came from, but it kind of stuck. But I figured if we're going to talk about it, might as well bring chips. So, unfortunately, there's no table. I can't spread them out. Sorry, guys. We'll have to share later. But it starts out with the urban renewal zone, which gives us site control and the ability to move quickly to amass parcels and make them available for development. We have a 40R district, which provides by right zoning for denser residential and mixed-use development in downtown in a district where it's not permitted at all. We have the DIF district, again, which helps finance some of the infrastructure improvements that are going on downtown. We created a housing development incentive program, HDIP, which is 40V, that offers incentives for market rate housing in gateway communities. We have expanded our historic preservation district downtown, and we've just submitted 2 more applications to the Department of Interior, and that makes more properties eligible for historic preservation tax credits. And of course, we also have the new market tax credits we're eligible for, and just recently now the federal opportunity zone, if somebody can figure out how that works. And I guess Ted will tell us a little bit more about that. Oh, I'm sorry, I need the clicker back. And if you're not familiar with downtown Brockton, if you were reading the newspaper, and you did a Google search, you wouldn't hear all these really great things because our local paper is not very strong. But when you map this stuff out and you see all the development that's been happening in downtown, these are projects that are either completed, are under construction right now, or are in the pipeline, meaning that they've been permitted and they're seeking financing right now. This is kind of, to give you an idea of the size and scale of these things, it's everywhere from, 28 units to 103 units. And it's commercial, it's mixed use, and it's residential. So it's a really great, healthy mix of investment activity going downtown. Yet we still have these large sites that could be made available. And we were working with the state and Mass Works, and we were able to get a grant to help finance a parking garage. And the parking garage is going to take out a whole bunch of surface parking lots, and we're going to be able to then make those surface parking lots available for development. And so when you look at the development activity, we call these the priority sites. You can see kind of in the middle right is the transit station. But all of this area along Main Street and within a 5-minute walk of the T station is kind of in play. And it's not out there by itself, because you can see here are the other projects that are moving downtown. So the market is happening. But our job now is to go out and find the investors, find the developers, find the end users, the end tenants, and make this happen. And so we're working very closely with Mass Works. We're working very closely with the Brockton Redevelopment Authority. We have a Brockton 21st Century Corporation, who is an independent economic development group that we need to restaff at some point. But things are happening in Brockton, and great things are happening. And as it affects transit, we're hoping that in the next 10, 15 years, we have about 1,000 new units of residential downtown. And that's us. Thank you.
Okay.
I didn't say anything needed to be edited, did I?
While I wait for that to come up, I'm Angie Constantino. I'm a senior transportation planner and mobility manager at Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District, aka SERPID, if you don't want to lose oxygen mid-sentence. So I'm a bit of a plant, a bus plant in this panel of TOD and development. I do mostly bus planning. I work very closely with SRTA, so Southeastern Regional Transit Authority in New Bedford and Fall River, and I work with GATRA, which runs out of Taunton and Attleboro. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some TOD projects that SERPID has worked on in some of our communities, and then talk a little bit about bus service and bus transit policy as it relates to TOD. Oh, I went backwards. Okay. So first example I'm going to do is Attleboro TOD. This is something that's been going on for a little bit. Attleboro repurposed a brownfield site south of downtown and southwest of the MBTA station. As part of that project, they created the Attleboro Intermodal Transportation Center, which GATRA moved their hub from where it was on Union Street by the police station over to now it serves the Intermodal Transportation Center, which is right next to the commuter rail station. They also established Riverfront Park all along the river there in the picture, and there's also 2 housing complexes planned. One is already built, so the Renaissance North is already done, and Renaissance South is in the works, so they're working on that, and you can kind of see right on top there, that's where the second location for housing will be. And I wanted to talk, so long-term plans are a lot of that TOD North is currently commuter rail parking, and some of the long-term plans for that space is to include a parking garage to increase parking not only for the commuter rail station but also downtown parking, as well as some additional housing and retail space in that TOD North. So that's one example. Another project I wanted to work on, so SERPID acts kind of like as technical assistance through our transit and comprehensive department. So we assist the town, and we were one of the partners on the Attleboro TOD project. But they had such a great, I wanted to mention that before I get to Mansfield, but they had such a great group of people on that project. The City of Attleboro, the Attleboro Development Authority, Congressman Kennedy's office, they had some great stakeholders in that project, which I think was important in making it successful. The next one I wanted to talk about was Mansfield, the TOD. So they identified a TOD area around the Mansfield MBTA station, and sort of just east of the tracks, they created a housing and retail space, Mansfield 1, that has been built already. So they've got some retail on the bottom, some housing on top, and they have more development planned for west of the tracks, but they're having a bit of a land acquisition problem, which I'm sure is a common TOD problem. But this is also a location that's served by GATRA bus service. So GATRA has a route that runs south on Route 140 from the Mansfield train station, and it connects to Wheaton College, which is in kind of the center of Norton, and then connects to additional transit service that travels to Attleboro and to Taunton. Oh, I ran out of. I'm okay. Thank you very much. The next example, I went rogue a little bit. I'm sorry. I went non-gateway city. Well, obviously Mansfield not a gateway city, but I wanted to talk just briefly about this. So North Attleboro is working on a TOD project that is not around a commuter rail station, and I just wanted to talk about it because of that reason. They have identified a TOD location in very close to downtown North Attleboro. It's at the location of the former Balfour site, so it was a industrial site at 21 East Street, and they've been working with this 21 East Street. Yep, 21 East Street. They've been working with GATRA, City of Attleboro, the Housing Authority to put a new hub there, so they're going to have so GATRA currently has a hub in Attleboro, so they run most of their buses out of there, so they're looking for other places farther out to create hubs. So this is one of the locations they're going to try, and the hub is actually going to be so on Holbrook and East Street. So the location of the housing where the Balfour site is right there on the right-hand side of East Street there, and then Holbrook on this corner will be a bus hub. And then, so the Balfour site will include 196 apartments, 31,000 square feet of retail, restaurant space, and also some infrastructure and public works work that has already happened, that's already done. Okay, so those are the kind of the projects that Serpent has provided technical assistance on, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about transit in general as it relates to development and some kind of bigger policy issues. One of the things is just keeping in mind to keep transit at the forefront of planning from the beginning. So it comes down to, letting regional transit authorities know about potential development in the beginning instead of bringing them in at the end. Often we Serpent gets a lot of MEPA documents from development. We try to let the RTAs know about ongoing stuff, but it doesn't always make it to them. And then often we get to a point in the development where somebody says, "Oh, did you talk to the transit authority?" And we get blank stares. And now we have to work backwards when plans are already made to figure out if we can fit a 30-foot bus in some little roundabout that they put in the front of the building. So just keeping that at the forefront. And then another thing is, I talked a little bit about the MEPA process. And sometimes when developments go through the MEPA process, they'll get a mitigation letter saying, we really think based on where you are and based on the people that are going to go to your store, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but everyone already knows this process, but they'll say, we really want you to put some transit accommodations in. And sometimes, due to many factors, lack of communication or lack of information, sometimes those transit accommodations don't always make it to fruition before permits are issued to the development. So, and that can make it difficult for RTAs to then provide service. So then the public says, I really want to go to this store, I really want transit service to the store. Well, it was already built and the accommodations weren't put in, and now a bus can't get into that parking lot and it's not safe. So it really has implications over the long term to not include the RTAs in the beginning. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was TODs in general. And mostly about, traditional TODs, pie in the sky, utopian TODs, you kind of think of like a little village, right? A little village around a transit stop where you have everything you need and you don't have to own a car and there's stores and, kind of like, so everything's walkable and everything's close. But I feel like, our commuter rail stations are not quite that utopian, so that you need to get farther away. So if we're going to kind of market TOD locations, housing, to millennials or younger, ones people that don't want to own a car, that want to live this far out but don't want to own a car, I think we need to keep in mind that part of that is building strong transit authority, transit service. So adding buses to the mix and making sure, yes, we have this commuter rail service that's going to stop here and you live right next to it because this is where the condos were built, but you can also take this great transit service to get to your medical appointments, to get to your grocery stores. So really appealing to them in that way. And again, not even just providing it, but making sure, we talked about 15-minute headways on the train, but like, people in Boston are used to 5-10-minute headways on transit service, and we need to make sure that, if we're going to appeal to that demographic, we need to make sure that we have the kind of service that they're looking for when they come out here. One of the great things that SRTA is working on right now through an ITS project is real-time information on their buses. So the idea that you can open up an app and you can see exactly where the bus is going to be and when it's going to be at the stop, instead of this idea of wait on the side of the road and pray. So that's a great thing. So technology and having the kind of level of service that they want, so that they feel comfortable moving this far out without a car and being able to get to the services they need. So that's it.
Next. Hello, everybody. I'm Ted Carman from Concord Square Planning and Development. Concord Square is a square in Boston, not the town of Concord, and it really epitomizes smart growth, as any of you know who might have been there. It's in the South End. And I've been working in gateway cities for well over 20 years and have done both development work there and also consulting work on some quite complicated financial transactions, such as the project that WBDC did in Worcester, which renovated the old T&G newspaper building into a community center, community college teaching facility. And I think we had close to 20 sources of funds for that project, including 3 or 4 new market funds. So I've been focused on how do you make projects economically feasible in these communities, which, as the mayor said, and others have said, is really a function of the fact that the costs here or in Brockton or in Worcester are close to the same as in Boston, but the rents are much lower, so you have a big gap. And the question is, the gap, a mortgage, because the rents are lower, what happens is and you also have the same kind of operating costs. So the net operating income that comes out of the projects ends up being substantially less than in places where it's feasible to build housing. So the mortgage might be 30 to 50% of the cost, which means that, and maybe you can get 20% of the cost as equity, so you've got a shortfall of up to 50% in these projects. That shortfall can be made up in a number of different ways. And I'm going to exclude affordable housing from this because most gateway cities have concluded they don't need more affordable housing, such as deeper subsidy kind of projects. The main source of funds for that is the low-income housing tax credit, which has worked in multiple projects in Brockton and elsewhere. But I'm more focused in this discussion on market rate housing. And there are 2 ways you could approach it. One is, if you have a historic building, you've got a big advantage because there are 2 tax credits for that, the federal historic tax credit and the state historic tax credit, both of which provide tax credits equal to 20% of the cost. So if you put them both together, you end up with 40% in the credits, and you can sell that for 80 to 90 cents on the dollar, so you end up with something like 30 or 35%. We also have the HDIP, Housing Development Incentive Program, which can provide up to 25% of the cost. So if you put those together, you basically can make up a good deal of the gap. Now, added to that now in many of the gateway cities is the opportunity zone. And the opportunity zones allow investors to take capital gains that they've received on the sale of other property or other assets and invest them in opportunity zone businesses. Actually, they invest into a fund, and then the fund invests in a business. And the beauty of this program was passed in 2017 in December in the Tax Act at that time, and I think it really has enormous potential for the gateway cities because it does two main things. One is it defers the capital gains tax that would have been paid on this capital gain that the investor had until 2026, and when you pay it, it reduces the tax by 15%, from 100% down to 85%. But even more important, if the investor holds the property for 10 years, when the property is sold, there's no tax on the sale. Now, this in itself generates a substantially higher internal rate of return for an investor. But I think even more compelling about it is that it enables people to avoid taxes. And so all of a sudden, it opens up the universe of investors dramatically, and it gives people an excuse or a reason, a rationale to invest in projects like this. Now, the other very strong argument that I think carries a lot of weight is the fact that in many cases, particularly Brockton, for instance, or New Bedford, where there's a comprehensive plan, it's quite easy for people to believe that rents are going to be significantly higher in 10 years than they are today. So if you invest today, there's a big upside on the project, and if there's a big upside and you don't pay taxes on it, it becomes very attractive. So the prospect of raising equity for these projects is now much brighter than it used to be. For new construction projects, the problem of building in gateway cities is even more difficult because there's no state historic credit and there's no federal credit. There's only the HDIP. In Brockton, it's right now working in two occasions where, one occasion, new construction is underway because the developer is very competent, has a lot of other property, and acts as his own general contractor. And when that happens, probably 30% of the cost goes away. So he's picked up 30% of the gap that he might have on that basis. But it's a special circumstance, and it's hard to do that in a whole lot of scale. There aren't many developers in the state that can operate on that basis. The other thing I would like to say is that the state historic tax credit and the HDIP credit also have allocations, and you can't use the credits without getting the funds allocated, and there's a lot of competition for the allocations. So for the federal historic tax credit, it's really quite straightforward. If the building is eligible, you design the building in accordance with the National Park Service requirements, which is a doable proposition, and when you get the building finished, if you get it approved ahead of time, you get the credits. You don't stand in line. For the state historic tax credit, you go through the same approval process, but there's $55 million a year that the Secretary of State can allocate, and he allocates it on the basis of applications 3 times a year in January, April, and August, and it can take several years to get the money, enough money to make the deal work. And that means that you've got to have a fairly long time frame. The HDIP credit has a different problem, which is it's administered by DHCD, and they are actually, I think they're doing an excellent job of trying to be fair and efficient with the allocations. But the HDIP credit is limited to $10 million statewide per year, and each project is limited to $2 million. So that means that probably you're going to have 5 or 6 projects per year in the state, which means this is not something that can be moved to scale. So I think what I'd like to sum up by saying is that having the plan like Brockton does, and having a lot of coordinated activity is absolutely essential and attracts developers like us to come to Brockton and try to make these things work. Doing historic buildings is important on two levels. One is that you retain the historic fabric and quality of the communities, and secondly, you have this extra batch of tax credits that you can get. And new construction, HDIP is terrific in that it will support new construction, but again, you get $2 million, so if you're building a $50 million project, the $2 million isn't going to go very far. And in those cases, you really have to wait until the rents get high enough so that you can support the debt, because there's no other way to do it. And I would say, in terms of new markets can be used for housing, but it's very difficult. You have to have 20% of the project has to be commercial. But the problem is new market allocations are done mostly on the basis of job creation, and you don't create a lot of long-term jobs when you build housing, so you end up being pretty low on the totem pole in terms of getting allocations with new markets. It can work as a piece of a larger project, but it's not going to make housing work very well. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Bryan. I'm the Assistant City Planner for the City of New Bedford. I did prepare, thank you so much. Okay, thank you. I did prepare a few slides today to discuss transit-oriented development in New Bedford. I did not bring any chips, but I'm hoping that we can still have a good conversation about this following the presentation. So the City of New Bedford has two transit-oriented development sites. One is Wales Tooth, and the second is the North Station that is located just north. Both sites are approximately 2 miles away from each other at their center from the measurement. I can hold it too, that's fine. Thank you. So I'd like to talk about each for a couple of minutes and start with the Wales Tooth Transit-Oriented Development Site, which is on the left. So one of the strengths of that TOD is its proximity to downtown. There's also quite a bit of multimodal connectivity between that site and other transit hubs like the SRTA bus terminal, for example. There's also bike infrastructure, bike lanes very close by as well. And the desired use for the Wales Tooth site includes maritime, mixed-use business, and residential. The second site I want to talk a little bit about is the North Station TOD, which is right alongside the Kings Highway Plaza. That site is also very close to the highway and existing retail. However, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to further develop that site, as it is very underutilized, the Kings Highway Plaza. There's also very closely located dense residential to that site, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And desired uses for that TOD include mixed-use business and large-scale retail. So the Wales Tooth site, again, like I mentioned a moment ago, is very close to the downtown core. The SRTA bus station, if you look at that yellow outline here, this is the downtown area, and these maps are available in the back corner if you'd like to take a closer look at them. But this is our downtown area. The SRTA terminal is here. The State Pier is located here. There are several amenities that are very close to the Wales Tooth TOD site. I also mentioned, which is a little tough to see with the resolution here, but we're working on the extension of the blue lane, the bicycle lane, which would travel further north and also connect to Fairhaven as well. We have the Armory District, which includes Klasky Common Park and New Bedford's Armory. South Coast Rail is also proposing a ped bridge at this site to connect to the platform, which is that red asterisk. So that will be a great opportunity to connect dense residential with direct access to the platform. In addition to that, we have maritime industrial existing in that yellow polygon to the right. And our Hicks Logan Sawyer area, which is just to the north of Wales Tooth, just to the north of that magenta line, that is an area that we will look at in terms of zoning for future development of the site as well. I should definitely mention that this entire TOD is located within the opportunity zone tracks, which is a great opportunity for economic development incentives. The second TOD is North Station, and that is adjacent to the Kings Highway Plaza. Again, as I mentioned, close proximity to Route 140. It's important to talk a little bit about the new platform location. For a long time, the city was expecting that the platform would be located within Kings Highway Plaza. However, recently the platform was moved rather to the west side of the tracks. And while it's very close in proximity to where it was previously, there are several implications that will need to be researched in terms of traffic circulation and connectivity to development and also existing residential, the neighborhood, and I will show you another map with those connections. So the TOD site is kind of in that hatched purple. The station is the red asterisk. All of that orange-yellow area is dense residential, so it'll be very close to the proposed platform location. There are some wetlands that we outlined in a greenish blue, just to show you the current configuration of the Kings Highway Plaza. But what we want to work on, and what we'll be sure to work on with the community through outreach, is working on connecting that dense residential neighborhood to the station platform. We'll also take a look at what that new location will mean for people traveling to the station via Route 140. Previously, it would have been much more direct access. Now we'll have to take a look at what that means, what it means to have to drive around, what that looks like for people. And again, I do want to stress that we will certainly be in touch with the community because our outreach to the community is critical, and we value our residents' voices for sure. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do is see if we can have kind of two parts to the conversation. The first one, perhaps, what kind of learning, Rob and Ted, can New Bedford have, given some of the things that Kirsten has just outlined as possibilities? What do you think are the obstacles that we face in getting to the kinds of solutions that Brockton has so clearly come to?
I think one of the things that New Bedford alluded to and is important for most TOD development is there land available for redevelopment? And when you see what's going on at Wales Tooth or what you see going on at North Station, there seems to be a nice piece of property that could get revitalized, especially older, what they call gray fields, which are the old retail centers that have kind of fallen on hard times. We've got a couple places that are, old shopping districts in Brockton that are kind of, we're over-retailed. You don't stop in the store every day, and so you have these old retail districts that, made sense 30, 40 years ago, but, how do you shift away from that? And I wish I had one that was that close to a train station. And the other thing is connecting to people, and you're right on the money when you say that you've got to be able to connect to this this neighborhood. It's really important. I'm not giving it away.
Well, I think one of the big problems here is that your rents generally are $200 or $300, maybe even $400 a month lower than they are in Brockton. And we were all surprised a couple of years ago when the developer who now has the 42 units under construction, new construction, he finished a year ago a 24-unit project in a historic building that's in I would say it's not the best location. It's okay, but it's a little, it's a 5-minute walk from the train station. So it's, but he ended up getting rents there that surprised all of us. And I think that's what's made a lot of the things start to really move forward in Brockton. What I would suggest is that if there was a way to get a really first-rate new construction project built so you could see what rents could be commanded, that would really make a big difference, because chances are nobody's put into the market really top quality market rate housing. And the advantage New Bedford has reminds me very much of Newport, Rhode Island, where I started my real estate career many years ago. It's such the history here, the quality of the architecture, the quality of the buildings, the quality of walking around the streets is unique. You know, there are half a dozen places in New England that have the quality that New Bedford does. So once you can show what people will pay for rent, then more market rate development can take place.
Okay. Kristen, what do you think our biggest obstacle is going forward here in New Bedford?
I think there are some challenges that are applicable to both TOD sites. One thing that we certainly want to work on is really the connectivity piece at both sites. We do have a ped bridge for Wales Tooth, and that's really important in bringing existing communities closer to transit. We would love to see something similar at Kings Highway to encourage further connectivity between the dense residential, transit, and future development at Kings Highway Plaza and surrounding areas, of course. So I would say that's one of the opportunities that we have to expand on is connectivity in general. And I did want to just add to Angela's point that we've been working very closely with our partners and internally, interdepartmentally as a city to make sure that we are working together to put together the best product for the community, and trying to be cognizant of those planning decisions ahead of the game, making sure that we have multimodal transit opportunities and planning for that in advance so that we can execute them once we're able to is very important as well.
Well, following up on that, Angie, what do you think? I mean, how difficult is it to get intermodal cooperation in, what did you do in Attleboro? Because clearly you have some cooperation and working together. What do we need to do to make that happen in all of these kinds of enterprises?
Well, I think we were spoiled a tiny bit in Attleboro just because GATRA had already run, they ran their operations out of the Attleboro train station already. So it was really an upgrade to their transit facilities there to add more, bus accommodations and the amount of service that they could put there. I think, just building off what Kirsten said, I think one of the challenges is going to be the idea of moving people and thinking about it in really kind of like a holistic way. So, everybody has a part to play in it to bring everybody in the beginning. So regional transit authorities, South Coast Rail, TNC, so Ubers and Lyfts, so they can be a complement to transit and other services to try to figure out how we can move people around without owning vehicles. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is to figure out where everybody's piece fits.
Go ahead.
One thing you might think about is using the opportunity zone to raise more equity. In other words, instead of thinking about the equity being 20% of a deal, think about it being 50% of the deal. And if you could, and so it would be patient money. In other words, it's money that comes in, you build something really extraordinary to see what kind of rents you can get. You understand there's going to be maybe a low return in the early years, but if it works, 10 years down the road, you sell the property and you don't pay any taxes on it. That actually might work with HDIP to make a new construction project feasible.
Great. I have a tough one for Rob, if I can. South Coast Rail, if Jean has her way, we're going to have trains in 2022, right, Jean? It's all on you to get this done for 2022. And so when we look at what's going on in Brockton, and you look at the quality and the level of construction and projects, how are we going to manage the expectations that people have, okay, to get to that kind of level of development? I mean, it's really a 10-year process. I mean, it'll be 3 years before we have any rail, and then, you know, development is going to take another 5 and 7 years. And we've already got people that are absolutely dying, you know, to see this kind of development. How do we manage that? How do we keep people, you know, to stay invested and manage that expectation?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's easy to highlight a project and have people come down and say, "Ooh, I'm the first one in the neighborhood," and then some of the other components, the amenities, the transportation, takes a lot longer, and people kind of lose focus on what's going on there. And I think that's why something like rail vision is so important. As we look at how to improve headway. There's not a lot of major investment that needs to be made for some of these projects. It's not like you need to have the north-south rail link or new track built. A lot of this is switching and signaling and communications equipment. So we could really score a big win with that right away. Also, having people, being upfront that some of these transportation improvements are going to take a while. But also, you look at what's happening here in New Bedford. There's been a lot of investment, and I was really impressed with the tour that we just all took. That all this first floor retail is going in, and it's becoming a very active, walkable community, and that's before you get the rail. And so communities like Brockton and Lowell and other places where we're really working on filling in the existing spaces, not waiting for the big triples and home runs, but if we have enough singles and doubles, we start building that pipeline.
Others? Thank you. Others? Go ahead, Kristen.
I will add that the city is certainly looking into improving access to where the platforms are going to be located. For example, there's an existing TIP project on Tarkin Hill Road that will improve access, improve turn lanes, improve sidewalk access. So we are thinking about these things in advance of the platform being rooted at that site. Additionally, we're also trying to create a sense of place in these locations. So we're thinking a lot about placemaking and wayfinding, how to make it easier for the transit user to orient themselves in the city and find their way easily and from the platform to the downtown, for example, if you're at Wales Tooth, and improving that experience once you get off of the train or get to the train. That's something we're keeping in mind as well.
I have a question, and then I'd like to throw it open to the audience to ask questions. And my question is, we've been talking about the specifics of what's happened in Brockton, what's happened in Attleboro, and here in New Bedford, we're 10 years away from being at the same place. So what are you thinking about now in terms of the Rail Vision project for your cities, and what's the future 10 years from now going to look like if you've already got, transit development that's occurred? What's the next step? What's going to happen in this rail visioning kind of project that Dr. has alluded to?
So I think in terms of GATRA specifically, I think that there are ways, and I touched on this before, to kind of improve the transit user's experience. And I think that's going to be ways to bring technology in. GATRA doesn't have the vehicle tracking software that SRTA is now installing, so including some of those ways to make it easier for transit use. And I think there's a lot of TOD area on that south part of that TOD that has not been developed yet. So I know they hit a bit of a snag with the Renaissance South to try they had to switch developers. So things are a little bit farther behind, but I did see that the mayor is moving forward on the parking garage. So trying to just, transportation slowly move those things in. But I feel like there's a lot more space to go on the south, and just kind of keeping a holistic view of it to try to make sure that we're bringing all the partners in. I think there's some opportunities from bike share and stuff, expand on the modal.
Ted?
Thinking 10 years out, there's some really extraordinary research being done academically about the economy, and particularly the economy in places like Boston, San Francisco, New York City, and Washington, D.C., which have high total factor productivity, TFP. And in these communities, what happens is, because of the confluence of the businesses that are there, the educational institutions, the hospitals, the resources, the money, these communities want to expand. And what happens when that expansion is thwarted by a lack of housing production, which is certainly the case in Greater Boston, what happens is you get much higher housing costs and you get higher wages, but you don't have that many new jobs. So what Tracy showed us in that first slide was the potential for the gateway cities is 140,000 new people living in the cities and 140,000 new jobs. And I think if all of this can be brought to scale in some fashion so that those 140,000 new units actually get built in the gateway cities, then what you're going to see is the jobs moving into the gateway cities as well, as they become much more attractive places for people to be. So that's the challenge. The challenge is how to get these ideas from, we now know that they work, how do you get it to scale so that thousands of units can get built in the communities that need them and want them, and in the process take some of the pressure off Boston and continue to allow the economy of Greater Boston, which extends down to here, to grow.
Great, thank you. From the audience, questions? Right here.
Question about the opportunities of funds. Where do we find the funds? Are they geographically focused? Do we bring them on in and give them a tour of our properties that need to be redeveloped, or how do we do that?
Well, what you have to do, basically, the city sets up an opportunity zone. And so if you invest in an opportunity zone business, which is a business located in the opportunity zone, then the investor is entitled to these benefits. So what you have to have is a business, which can be a housing project, or it could be one of the fish processing companies here. If you have that business, then you can bring equity investment into the business, probably through an LLC, by bringing in investor members into the LLC. The way they've set the regs up at this point is that the money has to be invested into an opportunity zone fund within 180 days of realizing the capital gains, and then the fund has to invest the money into a business, and the business has to have basically spent the money on the project within 31 months. So it's really a question of finding finding a project. The project has to be economically viable, and then you have to bring investors in, and if it's done on any scale, you've got the issues, blue sky law issues, SEC issues. It's probably a Reg D offering. Does that answer your question?
Another thing about the opportunity zones and the opportunity funds is that anybody can set up an opportunity fund. I just have to send off a form to the IRS every 6 months to say, I'm a fund. So to be able to have assets roll over, I could sell all my Apple stock and instead of retire, I have no Apple stock, I could create an opportunity fund. As long as you're making those investments into the zone, and that is rife for shenanigans. Because they don't come, you don't apply for special permits or anything from the state or the local government. We have no control and idea of where the funds are being used. But we do know that there are major investment management firms down to people like Lisk and MacArthur Foundation who are trying to put together their own funds for cultivated. It's slower, more patient, targeted investments, not just Jared Kirshner properties.
Well, the problem is that the regulations, which are not complete yet, the regulations make it very difficult to get let's say $50 million into a fund and then put that money out into separate businesses, because the timing of it all has to be so precise. You only have 180 days to get the money into the fund, and then it has to go into a business. The business has to spend it. And so they have not set it up in a way that makes it easy to use.
Sure. But let me suggest this, though. You know, here in New Bedford, the Economic Development Council and our staff there are a one-stop shop for any kinds of development projects in the city of New Bedford, whether it's TIF, whether it's planning, whether it's understanding the planning process, involvement with city government. You know, Derek Santos, who is the executive director, is available to anyone who would like to have a conversation, and we have done some research on the opportunity zones. They are as complicated as Ted has indicated, quite frankly, but we view them as an opportunity, and as the regs get promulgated, we will have literature and whatever else is necessary for those of you who are interested, and we'll be able to help you through that process, just like we would do with a TIF process, or working with our job development agency, the Workforce Board, to find employees. I mean, those are the kinds of skill sets that we have at the EDC and are available to all of you. More questions, please. Yes.
Can you imagine, or how can you imagine a future in which a good marine transportation system captures 3 islands and connects them with New Bedford as a transportation hub? How do you see that evolving? How do you see the cultural, social, and economic life of 3 islands treated as one community working together, or at least 3 communities that might work together, which people can use the assets of both places for whatever, school, art, work, education, and trade and raise both islands and eliminate the need for so many automobiles.
I think this is a wonderful topic. When we start talking about 10 and 15 years down the road, absolutely what the city of New Bedford needs to do is engage in this conversation. We have ferry service, okay? The ferry company runs a shuttle bus to Providence, but it's not a fully integrated system, and that is clearly what the vision or the visioning that needs to occur, you know, over the next 20 years, because New Bedford is ideally located in that regard, and for the entire South Coast region. So I think that, you know, one of the things that we will come away with from today is to start that kind of thinking. Once we get beyond the, you know, figuring out Whale's Tooth and North Station, okay, how do we integrate all of that with some really important kind of planning? And quite frankly, I'm not sure what the vehicle is, and I think that's one of the biggest questions that we have to ask ourselves. Who and what is the vehicle around which we're going to do that kind of planning? Is it a SERPED responsibility? I mean, it's the Southeast region, right? I mean, is it? How do we interact? Is it the Chamber of Commerce that starts the conversation with other chambers of commerce on the Cape and in Fall River and on the South Coast to say, wait a minute, these are some of our needs. What's the government? Certainly county government is not the place you're going to do this, and so we really need to ask that question. And certainly, I think Mass Inc. could be very, very helpful in asking that question in a way that then leads to some real outcomes around that kind of planning. That's my take. I don't know if the others would like to comment as well, but it's a real issue. Tracy?
I just want to say that coming from Seattle and having been there for many years, of course, there is Seattle itself, which is 42% water. And then you also have all of the island communities. And they were all at the table as a part of the planning process with the planning agency, as well as they do have strong county government there. The county governments were there, the municipal governments were there. So I mean that's just going to take some relationship building and planning and coordination, both through your regional planning agencies, but also within your municipalities, to make sure that people are coming to the table and thinking about ways to integrate not just rail service, not just highways, but also ferry service. I mean, it wasn't unusual for people to be able to boat to work with their rowboat, with their canoe, because there were docks all throughout the city so that people could get to and from where they needed to go. But all of that takes coordination and planning and thought about how to move people in the most effective way.
I was just going to add that those connections that New Bedford can have to the islands can also be done out of Barnstable, and you have the Cape Flyer right-of-way that comes through Brockton and out that could serve and connect Buzzards Bay and Hyannis to downtown Boston eventually. Because then we get better access out to the Cape, which is important for us.
Yes. Okay, sorry. We have time for one more question.
Comes out as intelligent as it is in my head. But when you're talking about more people coming in, attracting people from outside town coming in to live and stuff like that, right now New Bedford is affordable, right? I live here because I can afford to. If you triple my apartment rent, I can't afford to live here. But if I lived in Boston, my rent tripled, it's their rent cut in half, right? So I think it's good that we want people to come in. But is there anything in all of this consideration for the people who are already here and might have to leave because they can no longer afford to live where they enjoy living? And, I just want to think about that.
It's not just New Bedford, it's happening all over the place. And as values rise in Boston, we're getting people pushed out to other communities. And people are moving out of Boston and into Brockton. And then there's people being pushed out of Brockton into Fall River and other places, which is kind of amazing. One of the things that we have to do as planners is make sure that we keep growing the availability of units at all income levels. So the need to grow affordable housing is just as important as the need to grow market rate housing. And to keep some of that permanently affordable is also, is one way of doing that. But having more units also helps slow the rent increases or slow the housing increases.
I will add that we are certainly looking further into the plans for these two sites and the implications of them in many ways. So I thank you so much for your comment, and we'll be in touch with communities to get feedback like that from you and address some of those concerns as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Chips will be on the table.